So, hello everybody. This is yet another episode of our evolution seminar series. Again, just as a quick reminder, this is an online seminar series hosted by the Department of Biology here at Western, and I am your host, Matheus Sanita. And today, I must say, I am honored to have here with me a friend, Brandon Sheppard. He attended the OE3C earlier this year, the Ontario Ecology, the Ontario Ecology, Ethology, and Evolution Colloquium, which we had the pleasure to host here at Western. And not surprisingly, he won one of the Best Talks awards. So I'm very happy to have Brandon here with us today. He currently is a master's student at the Martin Lab in Queen's University, and he's going to be telling us everything about his project today, and I'm very excited. So Brandon, with that, I would say take it away.
Yeah. So I am Brendan. I am from the Martin Lab. I am from Queen's University, and I am a master's student. So already we're off to four good starts. I had a great time at OE3C this past summer presenting some of this work, and I'm excited to share that the presentation I'm giving today is a really big major step forward from the work that I was able to present at OE3C. So without further ado, let's take a look at what's going on in the question of, does adaptation a challenge compromise competitive ability? So to start us off, one of the big questions that ecologists face today is, why do species live in some places and not in other places around the globe? In other words, why are there these kind of limits on species distributions? And one of the major ways that we like to, or that researchers like to kind of address this question, is with the idea of gradients of challenge. So for example, the red fox lives in temperate, warm North America, and the Arctic fox lives in the cold, snowy Arctic, and never the two shall meet. Except with climate change, which is, of course, allowing the red fox to introgress into the range of the Arctic fox. And this has serious consequences because the red fox is able to consistently outcompete the Arctic fox for resources and territory. And that kind of is driving the Arctic fox out of its range. And so this is how we see that kind of competition, these differences in tolerance of environments, is creating these kind of limits on species distributions. And we see this pattern repeated pretty frequently across all sorts of different organisms and across all sorts of different gradients of challenge, where you have a dominant organism living in preferable conditions and a subordinate organism living in unpreferable conditions. And so the dominant is the one, obviously, who beats the subordinate. The way that we know which conditions are preferable is we do these experiments called reciprocal transplants. Sorry, reciprocal removals. And so in reciprocal removals, you take one organism out of the environment and you see how the other organism responds. And so if you take the subordinate out of the environment, the dominant organism will not move into the subordinate's range. And in fact, if you transplant a dominant organism into the subordinate's range, it doesn't perform very well. It usually dies. It can't tolerate the conditions of the subordinate's range. If you do the reverse, however, and you take this dominant species out, the subordinate is happy to move into the dominance range. And in fact, it performs better in the dominance range than it does in its own native range. And so this really suggests to us that both species would prefer to live in the conditions that the dominant is occupying. But because of competitive exclusion, the dominant is keeping the subordinate out of that range. And so that's how we know which conditions are preferable. It all suggests to us that there's some sort of trade-off going on where some species are investing in competitive ability and other species are investing in these adaptations to challenge. But we don't really know for sure that the mechanism underlying this pattern is a trade-off. And we also don't know how widespread this pattern really is. And so that's what we wanted to find out. So we took this big, broad question to start of, is the trade-off between competitive ability and adaptation to challenge really widespread? And there's kind of three things you need to answer that question. Number one, you need some sort of broad taxonomic group across which we can test for the signatures of this prediction. We also need some sort of generalizable gradient of challenge that all these species would have to respond to. And we need a measure of that response of competitive ability for these species, how they interact. So to fill in one of those blanks, we can kind of change our question to, does adaptation to climatic challenge compromise competitive ability between closely related species? Because climate obviously is a gradient of challenge that all species have to respond to. In fact, it's multiple gradients of challenge kind of rolled into one ball. And so if we take that question, we can produce three alternative hypotheses. Number one is kind of what our theory predicts, which is that adapting to novel climates compromises competitive ability. The alternative hypothesis is that climate adaptation could enhance competitive ability. And so this might be the case if the selection pressures that you're facing when you move into a new climate select for traits that also increase competitive ability. And so there we end up with your climate adaptations kind of aligning with those traits that increase competitive ability. And you end up with the double benefits of adapting to a new climate and becoming a better competitor. Finally, we could have no real relationship between climate adaptation and competitive ability. So the methods we used to figure this out, first thing we needed to do was find a study system. And so we have criteria for what a good study system would be. First of all, it needs to be diverse, it needs to be numerous. Second of all, it needs to be really broadly distributed, so we're capturing a lot of different types of challenge and types of climate. Finally, it needs to be really well studied so that we have publicly available or easily available information about where these species live, what sort of climate challenges they're experiencing, and most importantly, the competitive interactions between these species. So we can figure out who are those dominant species, who are those subordinates. One really good answer for all of these criteria, and that is birds. People love to study birds. People really have for centuries been collecting excellent data on where they live, how they interact, how they use their environment. So we have so much great data on birds, and birds are really broadly distributed. They fill all sorts of different ecological roles all over the world, and that makes them really diverse, really numerous. So birds are really a perfect study system for testing these broad ecological and evolutionary patterns and rules that we might find. So we have a great data set of 415 species pairs of closely related birds. That means that all these species pairs, both species in the pair is from within the same genus. That's what we mean by closely related. And that's just to ensure that the species are ecologically similar, they're competing for similar resources and territory, and so they will have these competitive interactions. And not only that, but the competitive interactions would actually matter for their ability to get resources and increase their fitness. We also, within these 415 species pairs, 279 of them are terrestrial pairs, and so those are the only pairs that we've used so far, but we'll later be able to incorporate all those marine pairs as well. But just understand that the species we're looking at right now are all terrestrial birds. And so the reason we have 415 specific species pairs is because these are the species pairs for which we have data on their competitive interactions. And so the way that competitive interactions are recorded in nature, typically you'll have some sort of resource available or a territory available, and then you'll have people observing competitive interactions for that resource. And so this might happen at bird feeders that have a camera on them, or it might happen like people put out a carcass and see how vultures compete for that carcass in the wild. It could also just be people have observed these organisms interacting in the wild. They recorded it when they were recording what the organism does in its environment and how it uses resources in that environment. And then we've been able to go back and say, okay, they found that this species typically beats that species. And so you can assign for each species pair a dominant and a subordinate. A cool thing about these competitive interactions, and a crucial thing for our study, is that they're consistent and asymmetric. So you almost always have one species beating the other species. It's not really context dependent, and that's super important when we're looking at these species living in different climates, right? Because it means that the climate is not really dictating who's competitively dominant. That competitive asymmetry is an intrinsic part of the relationship between the two species. We also have a really cool fact that larger species typically beat smaller species. This occurs about 80% of the time, and this is going to become really important later on. So just put a pin in this idea, and we'll come back to it later in the presentation. Okay, so we got our competitive ability data. Next thing we need is that climate challenge, that gradient of challenge data. And so we've got our global climate data from several available sources, and this covers gradients like temperature and precipitation. We're going to mostly focus on temperature today, but later on we might be able to get into talking about precipitation. And so how do these environments really pose challenges for the organisms that live in them? Well, they can affect organisms indirectly by changing kind of the biotic pressures of the environment, like the productivity and how much resources are available. It can also affect kind of the level of competition with other organisms in the environments and the availability of biotic interactions with those organisms to facilitate new resources and new ecological strategies becoming available. They can also affect organisms directly because organisms are susceptible to conditions in the environment like moisture or temperature. And so if you have to thermoregulate or if you have to osmoregulate, those are going to have effects on how that organism can survive in an environment and might require physiological or behavioral adaptations to compensate for those challenges. And obviously adapting to a challenge is something that often comes at a cost, and those costs could be on competitive ability. So to get the climate data for each of our modern species, we have these great species distribution maps for all bird species. And thankfully, these species distribution maps are split up as the breeding range, the resident range, and the non-breeding range for migratory species. And this allows us to really only capture the climate data for the time when the species is in each part of its range. Because obviously migration is an adaptation to conditions that a species can't tolerate or doesn't want to tolerate. And so we can't just look at what are the conditions throughout the entire year in this breeding range if the species only stays in the breeding range from like June to August. So thankfully we're able to separate it out and only grab the climate data for the months that a species is in each part of its range. And so we take the species distribution maps, we overlay them with our global climate data, we pull out the climate conditions experienced in that range, and this should be a close reflection of the range of climate conditions to which each species is adapted. Okay, so now we're going to zoom in on temperature again, and you can kind of represent these ranges of climate conditions that species are adapted to as these like 2D polygons, or in this case, it's kind of one-dimensional, really, because it's just looking at the range of temperatures that the species experiences. And so we can do this for each species in the pair. We get our dominant and our subordinate, and obviously they're experiencing different climates, but we want to know which of these represents the greater challenge, the greater climate challenge. And in order to figure that out, we need to understand how these climates can become challenging for an organism, and that means needing to look at the ancestral climate of each species pair. The idea here is that the challenge of a new environment comes from having to adapt to that environment and gain new traits or adopt new traits for that environment. And so the organisms that are living in environments that are more similar to their ancestors should be experiencing less challenge because they haven't had to adapt as much to tolerate their current environment. And so we can figure out those ancestral climates using ancestral state reconstruction. We know our focal modern species, the dominant and the subordinate, and we know what climates they experience today. We also know a bunch of their relatives, and we know what climates all those relatives experience today. And so this gives us a really general idea of the climates that are typically experienced by this type of bird, in this case, blackbirds. But we also have some other important information, and that's the phylogenetic relationships between all of these species. So because we're able to see how these species are related, we can then track what the most likely process was for the evolution of their climatic tolerance. So if we just plot in the kind of the relationships here, obviously if two species are both adapted to a warmer climate like these two here, then this would mean that we would expect their ancestor probably was also adapted to a warm climate. It would be, it's just parsimonious to look at it this way, Occam's razor, whatever is most likely, right? But when you're looking at a split between a warm climate and a cold climate species, that's where you're kind of wondering, well, what is this trait here? Is this ancestor adapted to the cold climate or the warm climate? It could be 50-50, right? So we start to look back further and see what the rest of the group was adapted to. And so in this case, we've said these are all adapted to warm climates. Therefore, we're assuming that this ancestor was probably adapted to a warm climate, and then this one was probably adapted to a warm climate, because it just makes sense that there'd be a single split to the cold climate rather than there being a split to a warm climate here and then another split to a warm climate here, with these all being adapted to cold. So just whatever is the simplest solution, that's usually what these trees should come up with. And obviously, I'm really simplifying the process here. The actual process involves a lot of math behind the scenes, using maximum likelihood, all that sort of stuff. But generally, we can reconstruct ancestral climates by looking at the climates of the modern species and how those species are related. And this allows us to figure out the climate experienced by the ancestor of the genus. We get a pretty good idea of what that climate should be because we have all this information going into estimating that climate. And so we get our ancestral climate. We can then go and plot this on our same plot of climate conditions here. So we now have three climate ranges on this plot. And you can see that obviously the dominant climate is overlapping with the ancestral and the subordinate is having some distance there. And so we get these different measures of kind of divergence from the ancestral climate, where here the dominant is more similar to the ancestor and the subordinate is more diverged. But we want to know what's happening in all of these cases, right? So we have a bunch of different pairs and we want to see generally who typically is living in a climate that's more similar to their ancestor. With the idea being that, according to our hypothesis one, if climate challenge is compromising competitive ability, then typically subordinates should be living in the climates that are less like the ancestor, right? More diverged. So that's what we're expecting, but we'll see when we do our actual analysis. But we're trying to figure out in each case who is more like the ancestor, who is less like the ancestor. So to measure divergence, I want to go quickly back to this sort of setup here. This modern climate could be the dominant or the subordinate in each pair. And we get our measure of overlap, and then we can compare that measure of overlap to the total range of climate conditions that are experienced by the modern species. And this gives us a percent overlap, which is a measure of how similar a climate is to the ancestor's climate. And so each species in a pair will have a different percent overlap. We can then create a ratio between these percent overlaps for the dominant and the subordinate. All that we need to understand here is that this is measuring relatively who is experiencing a climate that is more like the ancestor. And we can plot this out on this sort of plot here along the axis. What we end up with is values that are close to 0 means that neither species is facing a lot of challenge. Values that are up here means that the subordinate has faced the greater challenge and so has lost its competitive ability. And then finally, values down here, the greater challenge is faced by the dominant species. And this connects directly to our 3 hypotheses, where hypothesis 1, climate adaptation compromises competitive ability, greater challenge, greater climate adaptation, subordinate species. And likewise, you get our null hypothesis in the middle here. And finally, down here is where you start to see that alignment between climate adaptation and competitive ability, with one enhancing the other. Okay. So this is our general response. We want to understand which species is more diverged. And we assume this is going to be affected by a few other factors specifically related to kind of the nature of the divergence of each pair. And so this section is going to get a little bit complicated, a little bit intricate, but I think it's really important for understanding what our results mean at the end. So the first thing we want to understand is the difference in divergence. And I'm going to go through all of these in just a moment with more detail. The next thing is maximum divergence, direction of divergence, and finally the pair age. So starting off with difference in divergence, this is an example of a species pair that is low difference in divergence. Both species are basically have the same or very close to the same divergence from their ancestor. This is an example of a species pair with a high difference in divergence. The subordinate is much more diverged from the ancestor than the dominant is. And moving on to maximum divergence, again, this is a case of low maximum divergence. This is the maximum divergence of any species in the pair, and it's relatively low, whereas this would be a high maximum divergence, right? And you're probably thinking that there's a little bit of an issue here in how we define these 2 predictors, because they should be connected. You can't have a difference in divergence that is greater than the maximum divergence within a pair. So that's a bit of a problem, and I'm going to have to walk us through how to solve that. So we recognize that this was going to be a problem because there's really only 3 different types of combinations you can get, right? Because you can't have any difference in divergence that's higher than your maximum divergence. You can only end up with pairs like this, where both are minimally diverged, and pairs like this, where both are significantly diverged. You'll never end up with anything in this quadrant here, so I couldn't even plot for that, because it can't happen. And we do actually see that in our data. We end up with this really strong correlation where, again, your divergence is directly correlating with your difference in divergence. It can't exceed that linear relationship there. So that's an issue. But we figured out a way to solve that, which is basically we do a principal components analysis where we we're able to look at the variance in this plot along different axes to remove the effect of missing all this parameter space. So we established one principal component here, which explains the most variation within the data set. And then we established a second principal component here. And this is, I think this is a really cool way of being able to combine these 2 measures of divergence into one measure that isn't facing correlation problems and also captures the actual range of divergence more accurately than what we had before. And so really all we need to know from all of that is that principal component 1, when it's a low value, it means that both species are minimally diverged. Whereas when it's a high value, it means that one species in the pair is highly diverged. And then principal component 2 measures if both these measure. It's not, it's not coded like that, but that's when you look at the data, that's what they end up representing. So we can move on to a simpler one here. Since we're looking at temperature, the direction of divergence is really about, are you adapting towards colder temperatures or warmer temperatures? And we think that those could affect competitive ability differently if you would have different adaptations to cold and warm, and those might have different effects on competitive ability. So we can plot out our temperature here. You can imagine that you could have a species pair where you're adapting your biggest level of your biggest divergence is towards a colder or a warmer temperature, or you can have a species pair where your biggest divergence is towards a colder temperature. And so this can go either way. Finally, pair age. So obviously these species pairs can diverge at very different times. Some species pairs diverge like 60 million years ago. It could still have a large degree of variance. Are we okay? Okay, so we're back from a fire alarm, and I'm going to just start off again on pair age, and we can cut that together wherever we need to. So yeah, the other way that the other kind of predictor that could affect the direction of divergence, or could affect which species the dominant or subordinate is more diverged, is pair age. And so pair age, all of our species pairs are from within the same genus, but some genera are diverged 60 million years ago, others are diverged like 1 million years ago. And so we end up with a really significant variance in terms of how long these species pairs have been separated for. And this could result in different amounts of evolution to whatever climates they exist in. The confounding factor with this is that evolution happens at really different rates. And so you might evolve to a new climate within 1 million years in the same degree of evolution as you would have over 60 million years. It really, you can't correlate the length of time over which evolution has occurred to the amount of evolutionary change that has necessarily occurred, especially for traits like climate tolerance. So this is something that we felt was necessary to include because there's significant variance in it, and it could affect how these species are able to respond to challenges in their environment and then possibly overcome those challenges over evolutionary time. And we do have good evidence that some costs of competitive ability can be reduced for older pairs because they've kind of been able to compensate in other ways, or to diverge more into using other resources. So an important factor, but possibly there are explanations for why this might not be relevant to our study. Okay, so we have our response variable, and we have all of our predictors. And so the first predictor comes in as kind of these two measures, or these two components of divergence, PC1 and PC2, which are combinations of these two factors up here. Finally, we got the direction of divergence and pair age. And we're also looking for interactions among all of these factors. Now we get to go into the results. So we plug this model into our model selection. We do all of our model fitting. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but the result of model selection, the top model, was the model that included principal component 1, so a measure of this divergence, and then direction of divergence, plus an interaction between the two. And so we were able to plot that on a plot that looks like this. And I've got these labels here for now, but I want to make it easier to understand. So I'm going to replace those with what these variables actually mean. So on the y-axis here, we're looking at, is dominant or subordinate more diverged? This is the same sort of axis that we were looking at earlier. And so as you remember, up here, greater challenge is faced by the subordinate. Down here, greater challenge has been faced by the dominant species. And on the divergence measurements down here, remember that the low values are going to represent low divergence for both species. And up here, the high divergence represents high divergence for just one species in each pair. Finally, we have our direction of divergence measurement, which is either towards colder temperatures or towards warmer temperatures. Okay, I think we're ready to look at the results. So there they are. These are the results of our big model for temperature and divergence and all that. And you can see we've got a lot going on. So I want to kind of clean this up a bit so we can clearly look at some results here. So here we've got just the trend lines. And let's start by looking at what happens with cold challenge. So you can see with cold challenge that when you face a small degree of cold challenge, subordinates are more diverged. And so this supports hypothesis one, that adaptation to challenge compromises competitive ability. But when you face a high degree of divergence, so like really cold temperatures, then you actually see that the dominant species is more diverged. So that's interesting because we're getting support for both alternative hypotheses here, just under different conditions. So in order to understand what these results really mean, I think we need to take a closer look at kind of how organisms adapt to the cold. So there's a couple of major ways that organisms adapt to the cold. One way is through behavioral changes, and so this might include things like burrowing. A lot of small organisms burrow in order to escape the cold. They keep all their heat in these little holes under the snow or under the ground. That's a great way to stay warm in a cold environment. Obviously, burrowing is easier if you're really small, so that might be another kind of related factor there. Another adaptation to cold environments is smaller extremities, and this is called Allen's rule for those of you familiar with ecological rules. Typically, we see that organisms in colder environments have this like shorter snouts, smaller ears, stubbier legs, and this is assumed to just be because these extremities are a great source of heat loss. And so in cold environments, you want to conserve that heat. So you're going to just bring everything in closer to your body, huddle up, just like when we go into the fetal position to stay warm. The last major adaptation that organisms have to cold temperature is larger size. And so this is obviously also for thermoregulation. If you're in a bigger body, you can conserve more heat. And this is a pattern that was observed way back in the 1800s. It's been called Bergmann's rule. There's inconsistent evidence to support it. Some studies find really good evidence, really widespread, others don't. And so people have been trying to understand when and where Bergmann's rule works for a long time. But I mentioned earlier that the fact that larger species are typically dominant over smaller species was going to become relevant later on. Now it does, because if organisms are getting larger in colder environments, that could explain why we get this dominance adapting to more challenge, or dominance experiencing more challenge, because as they experience this really cold temperature, they adapt by getting bigger and then they gain dominance. But why don't we see that with a small degree of temperature challenge? Well, it could be that these organisms experiencing a small degree of temperature challenge either aren't getting bigger enough in order to really show that increase in competitive ability, or it could be that they're when there's only a small degree of cold challenge that you're adapting to, you might have different adaptations to that cold challenge. So maybe you prefer something like burrowing in those cases, and that would kind of maybe favor smaller organisms, or it might just be a cost in other ways. So with cold challenge, we really do get results for both ends of the alternative hypotheses. And I want to just quickly plug back in the original kind of full data here, because there's something else I want to take a look at, which is that there's really two patterns going on with these blue dots, the cold challenge dots. You have this negative relationship here, which lines up with what we've seen in our data, but there's also this interesting positive relationship right here, which is not really captured in our overall trends. And so it kind of suggests that there's maybe two patterns going on. And we have a hypothesis to explain that. When this organism faces cold challenge, it has to adapt. And so there's kind of two ways it could adapt. It could get bigger, right? And once you're bigger, you're a better competitor. But it could also adapt in some other way, any way that isn't getting bigger. And if you're not getting bigger, we assume you probably aren't gaining competitive ability. That might be when you compromise competitive ability. And so that could explain that kind of positive slope there. So we figured this is something we're going to have to test in the future. But then we got really excited and we tested it this week. And so our preliminary results for this, the way we did this is we got this size for all these species that adapted to colder temperatures. And we asked for each species pair, is the species that adapted to the colder temperature, so the one that's adapting to the kind of the maximum divergence, the coldest temperature in that pair, is it dominant and larger, meaning that it adapted to the cold by getting bigger, and that bigger size presumably made it dominant over smaller species. And so we tested that. That's going to be showing up in the blue results here. The red is any other pattern that doesn't support kind of that hypothesis. And what you get from those results is that yes, we see that original pattern in the species that are showing that increase in dominance with more challenge experienced or more divergence from the ancestor. But here, I'll clean it up a little bit here. So yeah, we see this pattern here. When you adapt to cold with increased size, it is the dominant species that is more diverged. And that completely supports hypothesis hypothesis two, the alternative hypothesis of the alignment between climate adaptation enhancing competitive ability. On the other hand, with when you're adapting to cold without increasing your size, then it's the subordinate species that is more diverged, which supports hypothesis one, the idea that climate adaptation compromises competitive ability. So we're kind of seeing evidence that how you adapt to these challenges is what's going to mediate whether or not you lose or gain competitive ability as a product of your degree of adaptation. And so in species pairs adapting to cold, body size is mediating the effects of challenge on competitive ability. And that's really cool. But what about warm temperatures? So this one is a little bit less exciting right now. It's more exciting because there's a lot more work for us to do, but less exciting for this presentation because we don't have as clear of a result. If I just clear this up a little bit, we get to just the warm temperature pattern, you can see that the slope isn't really different from zero in most of the cases here. So at a small warm challenge, it does appear slightly that the dominants are more diverged, supporting hypothesis two, the idea that adaptation to challenge is enhancing competitive ability in these small degrees of warmer environment. Whereas when you're adapting to really high divergence or really like much warmer temperatures, we don't really see any kind of difference in who is dominant and who's subordinate, right? It could be either species regardless of how much challenge they have faced or how much they have diverged. So to understand these results, I want to look at kind of how organisms adapt to heat. And this one's a little bit more complicated than cold because heat can come in a lot of different forms. So heat can come in the form of rainforests, which are humid and have a lot of biotic interactions, high productivity, warm. But heat can also come in the form of deserts, which are barren and resource poor in some ways. They also have very low moisture, very low humidity. So really different experiences living in the desert versus in the rainforest. Also just big differences in what temperatures you experience throughout the day. As in the desert, it can get very cold at night, whereas in the rainforest, maybe not as much. So we've got these big different challenges, even though both environments are warm environments. And so this might be something that's kind of masking our results because we could have multiple different patterns within that warm temperature adaptation pattern, and we're just not seeing all those patterns because they're kind of all balancing out to show just no real pattern in our results. Another thing that could prevent us from seeing a pattern in our results is the fact that most of the species pairs that we looked at were adapting towards colder temperatures. I didn't show this data, but about, I think, 3/4 of all the species pairs that we looked at had divergence towards cold temperatures, whereas only like 1/4 were diverging towards warm temperatures. And so we just have less power overall to pull out the patterns that occur when you are adapting to warmer temperatures. So we don't know exactly what's going on here. It does appear that maybe when you adapt to a small degree of warm challenge, for some reason that is increasing your competitive ability. It could be that these warmer environments, maybe they're generally more productive. You have a larger, better access to resource, gives you a larger energy budget, which allows you to invest more in your competitive ability, but it's not clear why that wouldn't hold up over time. So we have a lot more thinking to do about why this pattern is emerging. And how we can tease apart what's going on inside of the warm challenge results. So in species pairs adapting to heat, we're still working out the answer. Speaking of next steps and things we're hoping to do, I want to cover 6 major future steps in this project that are going to happen hopefully over the next 1.5 years. First things first, we need to incorporate all those marine species. So in our total data set, marine species represent 1/3 of all species pairs, and yet we don't have them reflected at all in our results because we haven't incorporated these species. Marine species might experience very different challenges or respond in different ways than terrestrial species because they can live very different lives. And also you're going to capture a lot of extremes with penguins are not reflected right now in our results. Neither are ducks, gulls, herons, albatross, cormorants. There's so many different species that we get to incorporate once we add in these marine species. So I'm really excited to do this. We also want to be able to tease apart more of this body size, competitive ability, and climate three-way relationship, right? We want to understand how body size is really affected in hot and cold environments. When does a change in body size occur as a response to those climate conditions? We also want to understand generally how body size is relating to competitive ability and just when body size is an adaptation that organisms would adopt. And we also want to understand more generally the relation of climate. Do different types of gradients of challenge within climate maybe have different effects on body size? So if we look at not just temperature, but other things like precipitation. And speaking of looking at other gradients of challenge, that's another major step is we need to incorporate these other gradients. And so there's two main ones that we're looking at right now. One is precipitation. Obviously, precipitation, especially combined with temperature, can have a major effect on things like productivity. Another one is salinity. And so this would be specifically for marine species because salinity varies significantly across the globe. And we know that a lot of species have specific adaptations to the salinity in their environments. So this could be another great gradient of challenge that species have to adapt to, and they might adapt by compromising their competitive ability. Another kind of type of gradient of challenge we can look at is productivity. And obviously this varies a lot in different environments and is kind of an indirect effect of climate conditions because warmer, wetter environments can often be more productive. And so higher productivity environments could have a couple of different effects on how species adapt to them, especially with respect to competitive ability. If you're moving into an environment that has higher productivity, it means more resources available, which might mean you can increase your energy budget and invest more in competitive ability. And so that would be kind of hypothesis 2 of kind of the increase in competitive ability as a consequence of adapting to this new environment. But it's not as a consequence of adapting to a challenge in the environment, but by adapting to that challenge, you get access to all these resources. But another way that productivity could affect the competitive ability of organisms that are adapting to those environments is by changing the nature of other biotic interactions in the environments. So in environments that have high primary productivity, they often also would have more competition for the resources available in those environments and generally a broader spectrum of resources available. So organisms are more easily able to specialize on certain types of resources. And so if the competition is higher and there's all these other specific types of resources you could shift over to exploit instead of whatever everybody else wants, then it might not be worth investing in that increased competitive ability, and you might instead choose to go and specialize in some niche resource, which you would be able to get without increasing your competitive ability. So there's different responses we could get from primary productivity, and I'm excited to see how that does affect competitive ability. So next thing we need to talk about is how ancestral states might be relevant to challenge. So we looked at the genus ancestor for our measure of relative challenge, right? How have organisms diverged since splitting from the common ancestor of the whole genus? But there's other ways you can look at that because we have the data we know how these species are related to all these different ancestors along the whole phylogeny of all birds, basically. And so we're looking at kind of the genus ancestor right here, but the relevant climate adaptations might have been incurred way back here, or maybe they're incurred right up here. So we need to understand how strongly is climate tolerance really conserved so that we can understand when do the climate adaptations of this distant relative affect what conditions are challenging for our modern species. We know our genus ancestor, that's the one we've been looking at because we got all this great data to figure out pretty clearly what that genus ancestor would have been experiencing in terms of climate. But we could also look at the pair ancestor because this is more directly related to what conditions the ancestor was experiencing right before the split that led to our modern species. We can also look at maybe there's some sort of all birds optimum condition for climate. So for example, maybe all birds have some physiological internal adaptation that means that it is easiest for all birds to survive at like 20 degrees Celsius. And they layer adaptations on top of that allow them to optimize for other temperatures and climate conditions. But ultimately adapting away from 20 degrees Celsius is challenging because you have to add more adaptations, whereas adapting kind of back towards 20 degrees Celsius might alleviate that challenge because you can get rid of these extra adaptations and just rely on kind of what your family optimum is, what your original ancestral optimum would be. And so if you're alleviating challenge, maybe you can then invest more in competitive ability, even though you're adapting to these novel climate conditions. Okay. Other way that challenge might vary is across different groups of birds. So we want to understand really, do different groups of birds have different underlying or common traits that make it easier for them to adapt to certain types of challenge or make them adapt to certain types of challenge in different ways. And a good way of looking at this is kind of as limitations on their adaptive space or on what kind of underlying adaptations they might have. So hummingbirds, for example, are typically very small. They have to move very quickly, and they're really reliant on certain flowers and certain plants that provide them with their resources. And so these birds can only exist really in the climates that can support the flowers that they're dependent on, and they kind of have limitations on how big they can get because they have to be able to fly pretty efficiently and be able to kind of do their hovering like that. So there are limitations on the adaptive space that a hummingbird could occupy, and this might change how they respond to different types of challenge. On the other hand, penguins have adapted for millions and millions of years to really cold environments. And so you might see that penguins have all these underlying adaptations that make them really suited to cold environments, and then adapting to anything that isn't cold is specifically or especially challenging for penguins. And so that might be just another sort of phylogenetic signal that we could tease apart to figure out how different adaptations or different ancestral traits are affecting different groups of birds. So 6 big future steps. I'm excited to get to work on all of them. But I think we already have some pretty significant findings. We've asked how do species adapt to new challenges, and I think we've already provided really interesting hints to how species might be adapting specifically to the challenge of colder environments. And this has major implications for questions about what limits species distributions. If we can better understand the interplay of biotic interactions like competitive ability with abiotic interactions like climate tolerance, then allows us to better understand how these distributions are limited. Similarly, it allows us to also understand how resource partitioning occurs between different species. How do species decide to invest in the traits and strategies that are required to exploit specific resources? Another really cool kind of connection for all this is how species' competitive ability might be affected by novel challenges in the contemporary world. So we know that species are facing a lot of challenge from like ecological disturbance or increased threats of invasive species in their environments. And so these are great new challenges for the organisms, and we already have evidence that organisms are adapting to these challenges. And so if the broad patterns that we're finding over here about how species adapt to new challenges also hold true in the microevolutionary responses that species are demonstrating to the modern anthropogenic challenges, this could have serious consequences for how species adapt in the future, especially with respect to their competitive ability. Because if the challenge of these new conditions is compromising the competitive ability of these species, it might mean that over time, as a response to anthropogenic change, these species face a reduced ability to compete for resources and territories in their environments. And that can have major implications for the stability of these ecosystems and who's able to move in and out. So a lot of cool, significant findings here. I need to give a lot of acknowledgements though, because already this project has relied on the support of so many people. First of all, a huge thank you to my supervisor, Dr. Paul Martin, for guidance, supervision, collaboration, and just generally an incredible enthusiasm and scientific mind. He has provided so much help and is so crucial to the success of this project. I also want to thank Dr. Chris Eckert for really helpful comments and notes during my honors thesis program. He's also given me some great conversations where we were able to dig into some of these ideas. I have to recognize everybody in the Martin and Bonnier lab groups for invaluable feedback and discussion as we worked on this project. And also I want to recognize other friends and colleagues and professors who've inspired me, who've excited me about science, and who have just been really great resources of community and also scientific mentorship throughout my undergraduate and now graduate career. I want to give a special thank you to all of the researchers who have so far been providing data for this project. including the species distributions, global climate data, species interactions, and especially the phylogenies. There are so many researchers across the world who either publish their phylogenies in a way that I was able to access and just download and use, or who responded to my emails asking for access to these phylogenies and then granted me access to them so that I could do this project. So that was really cool, and I'm so grateful for all of the people who contributed to this wealth of data. I think that we're at a really cool point in the fields of ecology and evolution where we have so much data that is so publicly available that we can do these really broad tests that we never could have done before, and it allows us to answer questions that previously would have been completely infeasible for us to answer given the resources and time constraints that we faced. So I hope that maybe somebody seeing this project and what we've accomplished already so far will be inspired to tackle the daunting task of grappling with and collating all this data for their own questions and their own research interests. I need to give a thank you to NSERC, the National Science and Engineering Research Council, for funding, and Queen's University as well for also providing funding. And I really want to acknowledge that this work was performed while we were situated in the territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, and also that a lot of the data used for this study was collected in the territories of other Indigenous peoples around the world. And a lot of that data comes from a culture, a history of science that has not always been respectful towards Indigenous people or respectful to the lands of those Indigenous people. And I hope that we can move forward recognizing that and also striving for better science and better researchers who are able to engage with Indigenous people and with their lands in more respectful ways while still answering questions about just the fundamental knowledge base that we can have in this world. So that's what I hope we can achieve, and that's why I want to recognize where this is done and in what context. Thank you again for this opportunity to present on all this. It's been great, and I'm excited to talk about it some more.
Wow, thank you, Brandon. This, I must say, as I watched your presentation, I was thinking this will go to the textbooks in the future. It almost felt like chapters of different of ecology and evolution textbooks. So it was not only really well presented, but the content itself, the questions, the rationale, they're all very, very insightful and thought-provoking. So thank you for this. A lot of food for thought there.
Oh, you're one of the first 5 people in the world to hear about these results. We just opened this week, so
I'm honored. I am honored. Now I have a few questions, and obviously, as I'm not in your field, my questions will come from a more basic understanding of some of the trends you've touched upon. But during your talk, one thing I kept wondering is that, have you seen similar studies being done with microorganisms? Because a lot of the relationships you described, for instance, size precisely, right? They are, they pertain to multicellular organisms. And I was thinking about whether, people are studying, similar, well, not considering size, but similar ecological and evolutionary relationships, but with unicellular organisms, both prokaryotic or eukaryotic.
So I want to answer that in 2 parts, I guess. First of all, the studies that look at kind of the reciprocal removal studies, right? They have been done across animals and plants, invertebrates, vertebrates, everywhere you look. And so we have a lot of evidence of these kind of relationships of species that are better competitors or better at tolerating challenge. We find that in a lot of animals and plants across all organisms. And there's a recent paper from my lab, from my supervisor, that kind of tries to establish this pattern as a rule. This is the competitive exclusion tolerance rule. And I think one of the possible gaps in it is that we don't have as much data from those microorganisms. But so Lenski, I think it was, did some interesting work that in his experimental evolution, where he is able to show these trade-offs between how these bacteria, I believe it is, are able to compete, but also their competitive ability is compromised when they are forced to adapt to greater challenges in their environment. I don't remember all the details of it, but he exposed the bacteria to some sort of increased challenge, and he was able to see that it decreased their competitive ability. And I think competitive ability might have been related to growth, but you can see similar evidence, supporting evidence in basically any sort of organism that you look at. This seems to be a really general pattern across life that, competitive ability trades off or is not associated with increases in tolerance of novel challenges.
Yeah, I know which experiment you're talking about. It's
Okay.
I forgot the name, but they performed with E. coli, in which eventually they found populations of E. coli that they evolved the capability to metabolize citrate. Yeah, I
Right. Yeah,
think
the long-term evolution experiment. Yeah, this
yeah.
was earlier, I think, than that they had done this other one. It might be related to that too, though.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, yeah, it's the same guy, so same stuff.
Yeah, the same group.
Yeah. Yes.
Now, another thing I thought, and I apologize if you touched upon and I didn't pay attention to it, but all the ecological factors you are trying to investigate, to tease apart, I think I missed altitude. Would you be looking at species adapted to higher or lower altitudes? Now, I do understand that with altitude, there is also, gradient of temperature and productivity, like you mentioned, but are you looking at that as well?
Yeah, so altitude probably wouldn't be one that we would look at separately because that altitude data would already kind of be captured when we look at temperature in a lot of cases. Um, there have been specific studies that looked at altitude as a model for some of these rules that are generally assumed to change with temperature. So, for example, there are studies that look at Bergmann's rule of size change across altitude. And again, there's inconsistent results, but the inconsistent results for Bergmann's rule kind of lines up with what we found here, where we don't find that all species are adapting to cold with changes in their body size. So in some ways, that also connects. But you asked about altitude. Altitude, I don't think is something we'd specifically be looking at, but I'm happy to think about it some more and see if there's some other reason to look at altitude specifically.
Sure. And one last question. So, and I think you are tackling that by taking into consideration the phylogeny of species. But I was
Yeah.
thinking about the impact of different life history strategies. Like when you compared the hummingbird with the penguin,
Yeah.
and or any other type. If you're thinking about monogamous species versus polygamous species. But I think so the life history strategies are taken care by incorporating the phylogeny, right? Or not? What do you think?
Yeah. So I think that any of those sorts of differences in terms of whether it's a life history strategy or it's a physiological trait or anything, I think a lot of that is captured by the phylogeny because we are able to establish that these pairs are, or at least are compensated or considered independently. Um, and and we're also able to account for covariance within like phylogenetic structures. Um, the the other thing with life history is that life history would still be like kind of an adaptation to challenge, or it'd still be possibly something that would compromise competitive ability if you have to invest more resources in these life history strategies. So I think you would still see the patterns for it, even if the adaptation is a change in your life history strategy, because it's still going to require a change in how your resources are used or in how you allocate your time to certain behaviors. And so I would expect you'd still see those sorts of patterns between competitive ability and costs of adaptation.
Well, as I said, all what you presented to me, it felt like these information, these concepts are eventually are going to end up in textbook, like ecology textbooks. I really liked it. Well, and with that, Brandon, I must say thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today to present your data, your project. And I look forward to staying in touch and learning more about your future results and also future career.
I would just say that for anybody who wants to read more about these ideas, go read the American Naturalist paper that came out this past summer on the competitive exclusion tolerance rule by Paul Martin and Cameron Gallenborz. That's the big paper, a result of like 20 years of my supervisor's research. And I think that it is a really, really cool step forward for the field to be able to look at all this data in this new way and kind of direct us towards a possible new fundamental ecological rule. And all of my research is building off of kind of the results of that study. And so I think that if anybody's interested in this, that's what you should go to start.
That's beautiful. Actually, I can link the paper to the
That would be
post
great.
when I publish it, when I post your talk, I can link the paper.
Perfect.
Well, as I said, thanks again. Yeah, I look forward to meeting you in the next OE3C.
Yes.
And yeah, we'll certainly stay in touch. Okay. I
Okay.
will now stop the call, and I'll stop the recording, and we can chat a little bit more as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.